I also represent Tadeusz Pieronek Foundation. It was a few months ago, right before the war broke out, that we were thinking which subjects to tackle this year. This is when communications appeared on our radar. At the time, it was not about the battlefield or battleground, but it's communication where thoughts are exchanged and where postulates are presented and defended. But also it is something that provokes a public debate. February the 24th changed the way we saw this conference, so much so that we decided to take a closer look at what is happening in the sphere of communication as a battlefield or a battleground, if you will. So we follow what is happening in Ukraine. We are more or less emotionally involved, invested, but we don't really realize that we participate in this war, inverted commas, because we pass judgments in various reports, we share information in social media, we're active on various websites or on one side or another. This war in Ukraine saw the involvement of two sides also in this virtual world, in this infosphere. And we have experts that represent the analytic circles. Misinformation and disinformation is also what they follow and study. By the way, we've heard today, it is not only about fake news, which are a bit of a catchphrase, because when we consider what is generated by propaganda, especially coming from the Kremlin, it is usually summed up in this single phrase. Why is this issue so important? For a number of reasons. First, because it's not something that started when the war broke out. It is something that had existed before. It is something that has been going on for years. One of the sides, I mean Russia, had been preparing for a long time. They've been building various institutions that impacted the public life in Europe and in the world. At least $300 million have been disbursed by Russia to various organizations and political parties. We know that they were involved in Western Balkans, they were involved in Brexit, and they also shaped the public opinion using RT, former Russia Today, but also they have been heavily present in the social media. They've been deploying Sputnik, their website. They have also, you could say, mastered making politicians dependent on their influence and their finances. You can see it in some right-wing parties in the West and outside of the West. They have been also putting together various opinions that are later shared in the media, including mainstream media. It is something that needs to be tackled in public, and we shall hear from the following experts. Dr. Martyna Bildziukiewicz, PhD. He is as an expert in disinformation. Since 2018, she has been working for East StratCom task force. Since last year, she has headed a project, EU versus Disinfo. Please join us. Welcome. So we will combine two different perspectives, our Polish sensitivity with the data that is analyzed in Brussels. The second person that we have invited to this panel is Ms. Mierzyńska, a media analyst, a political marketing specialist. She is an author of a book on information threats, especially stemming from the Russian propaganda. She's very much active in the social media. Many of her analyses help people to realize that they become tools in this disinformation industry, in those processes. Hers will be a Polish insider's perspective, although somewhat adulterated. And we also hear from Robert Pszczel, a Polish diplomat. He faced this whole thing directly. He was a diplomat deployed by NATO, or rather posted by NATO in Moscow. He was the NATO Information Officer in Moscow. So it was decided that we needed to invite Robert. And Robert has this unique, extremely interesting experience because he was confronting his own opinions with the voice of the other side. You know, he was in the dragon's den, so to speak, or the bear's den, if you will. So what was uttered by Russian propagandists, the Russian media, was often, you know, stopped cold by a repartee from our guest. He works in Kazimierz Puławski Foundation.
Właśnie, drodzy Państwo, to zacznijmy od rzeczy elementarnej i podstawowej.
Let us start with the basics. Disinformation. When we hear this word, what is it? To my surprise, disinformation has permeated this language of ours. It was invented in mid-19th century in Russia. So our eastern neighbors have got quite a long history, not only in using this, but also in coining the concept. So, we are discussing a certain process. Russia started this process a long time ago indeed. But history is not what I want to focus on. The relevant thing now is that disinformation is a campaign. It's an ecosystem, rather, this is how I like to put it. So it is not just this single channel, 5 channels of Russian TV. What exists is a whole network of TV stations, social media. By the way, a number of various social media oligarchs. The Orthodox Church is involved in that, and we heard it in the previous panel. So it is a whole ecosystem. It is strongly linked to the Kremlin, to the source of power. It is active all over the world, in a number of languages, and they speak in one voice, they manipulate, they lie. Well, the goals are twofold. First, to present their point of view, but at this point, it is less important. The second thing is spreading chaos, wreaking havoc. It's about having so many narratives injected into this information zone that we are confused and we don't know what is true or not, so that we stop participating in a public debate, so that we become withdrawn, so that we are cynical, who we say the truth is somewhere in the middle. Robert, I've mentioned your experience, also your Moscow experience. You were observing what was happening then. Basically, they had been already then preparing this huge media offensive that we're witnessing now. So back then, did you realize that these are military exercises of sorts? That they were actually testing their capabilities? Because ever since NTV was taken over, it was years and years ago, this propaganda has been growing in strength ever since. You could say that this is a continuum of sorts. I mean the deployment of disinformation here. NATO, where I used to work, they defined disinformation as knowing dissemination, creation of manipulated information to cheat or mislead. It's the intent that matters. Misinformation is information that is not true, that might be misleading, but there is no malicious intent behind it. So disinformation is something that has been around forever. We know it's been around in the political discourse. It's about deploying various techniques to achieve some kind of an advantage in the public discourse. But for a long time, things have been getting more complicated. This is a certain policy that has been deployed by a country. By the way, Russia is in a way a successor of the USSR. So basically what they did was they deployed a whole industry of disinformation. Putin's regime has been gaining increased control over the whole Russian society. So what did they test first? So the first goal for the disinformation policy in the Russian sphere is the Russian society. Now, next come all these countries and communities that are Russian-speaking countries and communities. Now, let me give you an example. Those who speak Russian on an everyday basis, but are, nationals of the Baltic states or other countries where Russian rather is spoken. By the way, it's one thing to achieve your goals that is not fully mastered by the propagandist, and then we realize that this is an outsider's work. And thirdly, there has been a growing appetite in Putin's regime to influence what has been happening in the international sphere, which is why they decided to spend a lot of money. There is even more money, to be honest, because it depends on how you define it. It was the US Congress that did the study, 300 million. So it was about influence. Now, they also spent money on the public Russian TV channels, 1, 2, 3. They also serve to some extent or largely the same purpose. On top of that, you have the public discourse, which in other countries are never associated with propaganda or disinformation, namely the education system. Academic institutions too. Partly they're academic, partly they're used to serve propaganda purposes. It became more obvious in stage 1 of this aggression, 2014. So they used Russian parties. The same was true of Georgia, by the way. So the crux of the matter is disinformation campaigns are a part of what Putin's regime has been doing for years. It's linked to objectives. What's their objective? To influence others in a way that's desirable for the Kremlin. So making partners and allies quarrel and disagree. And it's about presenting Russia as a country that has a lot to offer. We have been dealing with it for years. So you mentioned mastery, having mastered something. Well, I'll not totally agree with it. What happens when you spend a lot of money, when all of the society are your lab animals, lab rats? They have a bit of an advantage in such a case. We, NATO, EU, cannot use and deploy disinformation propaganda to respond to theirs. So they have been somewhat successful, but let's not go too far, especially when it comes to creativity. What about the recent period? Propagandists have been having a hard life, because what they have been generating are kind of pathetic. They've been telling those fairy tales that stopped working even in Russia itself. An aside, if you will, you said, let's not exaggerate. In other words, let us not overly appreciate the success. So Russia Today, how come they were successful in US? So there were those Occupy Wall Street protests. They were very local. They didn't have a major social impact outside of a certain left-wing circles, this left-wing bubble. Well, yes, a few thousand people lost money during the crisis, and suddenly Russia Today turned it into an event, broadcasting live. And, you know, outside it seemed like the whole city, the whole New York was burning. And then they kept using these mechanisms. So Robert said there is a history of Kremlin propaganda, and we must not here focus on what a few Kremlin propaganda department officers do. Basically, there are whole troops that work there. By the way, they make very good money. They're really wealthy. So when I talked to Russian journalists, they said, you won't believe how many journalists are actually members of the financial elite. They are being paid by the state. That was linked to education and social programs in Russia. So children are toured, there are those Pabieda trails. They visit, those children visit the sites that are important for the current Russian history, 1945, and that is this, it is heavily militarily skewed. And the church is a part of it, there is the Ministry of Defense. This soft power deployed and targeted at the Russian society. Let's focus here, however, on what could impact us more directly. Suddenly, it has transpired that there are those arguments spread by the Russian propaganda, and those arguments are falling on fertile ground. And this is not only fake news, by the way, which is what you mentioned when you said disinformation cannot be narrowed down exclusively to this one single concept. Anna, is the mic on? Hello, good afternoon. Yes, fake news is but one instrument. Disinformation is a much broader concept. Manipulation, manipulating the context, manipulating time is a part of it. You hear info that is presented as current, where it's old news. All kinds of misreporting, as long as you do it knowingly, willingly, to achieve your own malicious goals. All of that is misinformation.
Well, were it all that simple, our life as researchers would be much easier. Let me refer to what Mr. Pszczel said, speaking about this industry of misinformation. Yes, I quite agree. This is an excellent notion in Russia. whole industry of misinformation was created. Now we know more and more about the way in which it functions. Apart from the media, main Russian mass media, that we can observe easily, there are also other levels. After the 24th of February, we've learned more about less visible areas. Let me give you some numbers. Might be interesting, but let me note that those numbers stand only for a small slice of the whole phenomenon. Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, recently declared that it found out, disclosed and liquidated accounts linked to a big network of disinformation of Russia. Not the first, not the last, certainly. But I'm mentioning it because more than 60 different websites were discovered that claimed to stand for well-known European media, 60 websites, where every day there was information given, news in different languages, because it was simply an attempt to copy well-known websites of well-known institutions, and false information was spread as a result. 40 websites pretended to be German websites, 20 other media, including The Guardian. There was an example truly impressive that the website that pretended to be The Guardian looked exactly the same. It was impossible to tell the difference. Taking into account the layout, the graphics, the website was basically copied. The same journalist photographed the same, just the text was changed. The text was quite real, while the false information was such that the butcher crimes is just attempt by the West to pretend that this truly happened, while it was of course false. When some domains were blocked so that such information is not that such misinformation is not possible, the website was moved very quickly to another domain with another address, and it was still functioning. So as a result, in this Meta breakdown, there were more than 100 of such attempts listed. Just one example. Another one, when on Telegram I was having a look at Russian disinformation networks. One of such networks every day presented Russian disinformation or Russian materials in 19 different language versions, starting from Chinese and then including Hebrew, all European languages. The idea was that the channels linked would publish the content in different languages, reaching citizens in those different countries. They don't need to speak Russian, they don't need to search for any content. The idea is that the content should reach all of them without them trying to find it. Not Telegram, actually. Telegram is becoming more and more popular also in Western Europe, but also such content could be found on YouTube. There were links to all possible social media, Facebook, Twitter, all the others. Russian and Ukrainian website also checked such networks, trying to find out more about them. One was found that had 88 different channels. All of them were addressed to Ukrainian citizens. It was a network of hyperlocal channels. So, for instance, a channel for the residents of a small location near Kiev, and there were local channels for them, created at the beginning of the war. First of all, information was put there, local information, with special profiling, especially during the siege of Kiev, when Russia was very interested in having an impact on the opinion of the local residents. But apart from the local news, because the idea was that thanks to the local news there might be local interest in those channels, that they would observe them, and as a result those channels will simply crop up, appearing on the screens. But additionally, simply propaganda Russian content was added, trying to undermine the authority of local leaders. so that the Ukrainians believe the Russian authorities, not Ukrainian. This kept happening. I could give you many more examples, maybe just one more before I finish. Russian intentional website, Portal Canu. One of the reporters actually contacted an administrator of another channel on Telegram. He actually asked a question that he's looking for people who would be supporting in information campaigns the Russian side. The journalist actually contacted him, and this was a classical, simple recruitment for so-called paid trolls on the internet. They get false accounts where they log in, they get their phone numbers. There was a norm they had to do, numbers of comments they have to write, concrete subjects with Russian content, of course. There were such numbers given, one room, one platform, one social media, another room, yet another one. So there was someone responsible for each of the media, and they were getting fairly good remuneration for Russia. Let's say average, not minimum, but average wages for Russia. And as the information was given on numbers, the number of people working there per shift, how many shifts were there, how many comments they actually had to write. Within 1 month only, this one network, because this certainly is not the only one existing of paid trolls in Russia, but only this one company, let's call it like this, one network, generated 1 million comments on the internet. One within a month. False propaganda comments. This is the way in which this network operates. I understand it's not this well-known factory near St. Petersburg. Actually, this was confirmed by the British intelligence, but we know that there are a number of them. It's not that there is just one, Prikozhina, there are many others. And there's also a Polish language section, let me add. Yes, of course, Polish is one of the important languages functioning all the time, yes, in propaganda. Why am I asking? Well, let me explain. The Kremlin, is it able and how successful is it in presenting its narrative by using this or that language? Because I'm mentioning here, the public discourse, no one would be saying special operation. We're clearly saying Polish war. No one would say that in Kiev there are Ukr-Nazis, but we use other words. We speak rather about Russists, right? I think the idea comes as an attempt to counteract Russian propaganda. Because in Russia, even if someone would dream at night about something with Nazis, it's basically like total ban or the biggest possible crime in this country. But to what extent is Russia successful? Well, I will make a somewhat provocative statement. First of all, we speak about an information war. We are part of this conflict. And who has come up with this idea? Information war. Whose idea is it? Russia. Russia introduced this term into our vocabulary. Well, a certain problem, yes. On the one hand, it's difficult to disagree. Yes, we are not in deep conflict. We are in war, also information war, yes. But on the other hand, when we speak on this, we are also using in a way this battlefield prepared by Russia. Many years ago, RT from Russia today, Margareta Simonia, said that it's like the long hand of the Minister of Defense of Russia. RT, since it moved towards disinformation after 2008, it was like another weapon used by the Russians. So we are already provoked as if we move and play the Russian game if we speak about this information war. Well, yes, if all possible Russian channels speak about Nazis in Ukraine, saying that Ukraine is governed by Nazis and that this so-called special operation its objective is to denazify Ukraine, I think nobody believes it among us here in this room. Let us hope in most European countries nobody would believe it. But as Robert Pszczel said before, This is the type of narration that is mainly directed towards the Russians, Russian internal domestic market. The Russians are treated as a test society, you might put it like this, perhaps, for this type of narration or narrative. One also needs to remember that this myth of fighting still in the former Soviet Union and victory over Nazism, it's a very important reference point in Russia still today. It's the only real religion, perhaps, of Russia, the 9th of May, not the Orthodox religion, other stories, or even longing for the return of communism. But on the other hand, we can see what I call a rebranding of war, the symbol of Z, and everything linked to that. I think you saw it around the 9th of May when we saw military parades almost copied from the times long gone, luckily 1930s in Nazi Germany. So we speak again here about spreading chaos when nobody knows what is true and what is not. There are such points, places where we refuse to be led up the garden path, but still there are some other ideas and other topics that we should raise. I mean here potential peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. We are in a very dangerous moment of history, in my view. We should have no doubt that the only negotiations, peace talks that can be held only when Ukraine wins and when it is clear that the Russian is going to be held responsible for what it has done and what it is doing today. But especially today, when our energy bills go up almost every day, when there is much uncertainty about what's going to happen tomorrow, we are more prone perhaps to disinformation, as the Russians are saying. It's time to start negotiations because the Europeans, it will be a difficult winter for you. Well, Ivan Krust, a very well-known sociologist, politologist in Europe, together with Marek Ronald, they published results of a survey about European opinions about the conflict. 35% roughly of Europeans wanted to compromise with Russia, mainly in France, Italy, but also Hungary. 22% of Europeans were saying that Russia has to be punished, that it has to lose. Also interesting, mainly the Baltic states and, of course, Poland. We had a certain idea, Putin verstehe, as they say in Germany. People who understand Putin, there is such a notion. I'm just wondering, because it looks like everyone seems to now consider him a criminal, but maybe there are some still Russia verstehe, people who understand, well, not Putin, but Russia. Yes, of course, this is a phenomenon that we can clearly see. Speaking to different media, I often look for some interesting ideas, words that could be some interesting food for thought, for instance, could easily be remembered. I believe in general that this is a very good, excellent question. What they are doing, we all know very well what they are doing. It has been analyzed very well. We know what the different channels are and so on. But perhaps what is even more important today is about the degree to which we are prone to this propaganda. There are different reasons for that. As Martyna said, the Polish society, for instance, is much less prone to different Russian narratives, misinformation. We've got our historical experiences, so we know exactly, no one needs to explain it to us. But this disinformation, it's not perfect, far from perfect, I would still say so, but it's as if Putin was putting a mirror in front of us. Let's have a look into the mirror. If we are quite happy with the way we look, then it will be difficult for foreign narratives to be accepted here. It's the Russian taxpayer that pays for Russia Today or other Sputnik stopped actually functioning in Polish. They simply believed that no need or doesn't make sense to publish in Polish, Scandinavian languages as well, some of them at least. So when we speak about this narrative at the fundamental level about what Russia is, its history, that Russia maybe has some rights, special rights. Well, as for those who are more prone to this narrative, these are the countries that perhaps have some their historic experiences that are not very perhaps proud of. They have nothing to boast about. Colonial past, for instance, countries whose names I do not have to list, but countries that are responsible for different military conflicts. So the Russians, yes, I agree here. For a long time they've been trying to act here. It's not the content for everyone, but it has very concrete addressees. But then there are other examples that can be made. There is reference here to the recent Elon Musk's tweets. The richest person there. It's like a Musk went off Musk, if I can put it like this. There were sometimes strange references, as you said, that well maybe we need to start some negotiations. But now his discourse now with Medvedev, complete idiot that is trying to threaten everyone with nuclear attack, and it's like almost a friendly discourse, including that Musk seems to agree or is asking actually, are you succeeding? Are you successful? Let us meet at the parade, even such a tweet. Well, there are examples of other people, usually men of average weight. Kissinger is different, perhaps, but he used to be an excellent analytic. But Fiona Hill also recently, for Politico, spoke on this ego trip. Vanity, perhaps, in some way. There are some people, celebrities in business, if they seem to believe that they're experts in something, being wrong, it seems to them that they have a role to play in history. And, well, this is the skill of Putin and his team, that they actually help them believe that. You might remember some clubs where people were invited, some of them decent, good analysts, historians, where they would meet, speak, and actually they thought that they would speak to the Tsar himself. They thought that they had an influence on his decisions. It was just the opposite. So is it vanity, or do we speak about political corruption, sometimes obvious, or is it about some business interests? Well, countries that have special problems with energy resources, as they had not done many things they should have done, they didn't listen to others, maybe they are more prone to such threats. Those countries that for years have become more very pacific today are especially prone to nuclear threats. So this is exactly this mirror that I mentioned, the mirror of Putin. Those who feel discomfort when looking into the mirror, well, they are more prone to such attempts to blackmail them. So, well, we have to search for answers, but at the same time, in short, when faced with disinformation, it's like when you're faced with some pollution. You have to simply fight it, but very often the problem is in you, the problems that you have looking into the mirror. You have to be aware of it, and as one of the goals of those campaigns is an attempt to divide the Western world, how shall I put it, attempt to undermine the authority of different democratic institutions. Well, sometimes it's just enough for one state, one well-known person that may actually contribute to such attempts. Well, we will always be trying to fight with just one hand tied behind your back, because there are some principles, of course, that we adhere to. But well, it's a fight, maybe not war, but information fight that has to be done, the problem is not going to be solved by itself. Some might wish for it to disappear if you don't react to lies, half-truths, disinformation. Some believe it will disappear, but it's not true. There will be many who for many different reasons, will simply accept such comments. Well, you have to find the golden mean, perhaps. But again, as I said, we have to think about ourselves, where we are and how we perceive ourselves. Putin comes later.
Right. Let us consider the language that disinformation is using. Is it about undermining certain democratic institutions? The Kremlin is trying to undermine the achievements of democratic countries. No such thing as free media. Even the remnants over there are gone ever since February 1924. Maybe a few websites, that's the only thing that you disagree even with that. Websites, something that broadcasts from Prague, Baltic State initiatives. People are putting something together in Warsaw, I understand. Can we do away with attacks on freedom of speech, on historical truths? Isn't it that actually it's the Russians who are setting the tone? What about the social media? Because you analyze the Telegram. Until recently, it was deemed to be the channel of the Russian opposition. People said, you need a Telegram account if you want to know what is happening. Because this is where you will find a different image of Russia. I'm not going to answer that. I'll pile on more questions. And you will judge whether we can resist such attacks. The basic question. We have an economic crisis in Europe. Why? Fill in the gaps with one word. Why do we have this economic crisis? If you say that the reason is the sanctions, this is a message that Russia is actually trying to reinforce. I'm not sure that they came up with it, but they are reinforcing it. And it is being reinforced by them in all channels. Crisis is there because there are sanctions. Just think about it. It's a beautiful message for Russia. It's ingenious. If you reverse it, if you want the crisis gone, do away with sanctions, and the crisis will be gone, right? That's the flip side. I see it in the social media, in the Russian media, and in the European media. It is linked to what is happening in Europe. People are afraid of winter. And the media are writing about that. So it permeates mainstream media too. Viktor Orban in Hungary started a social campaign. I think it's linked to that, right? He claims that the crisis is linked to sanctions, but that's a separate story. So, we're not hearing that the sanctions, that rather the Russia is responsible, or the war is responsible. No, it's the sanctions. So, in other words, the message clearly stated is it's the European politicians that are guilty because they imposed sanctions on Russia. You are going to suffer because of them. That you will suffer, cold. You will have lower standards of living. It's not Putin's fault. It's not Russia's fault. It's not because of the war. It's the European politicians who made a mistake. And this is a message that is being used and pushed everywhere. Can we resist that as recipients, as citizens? Russia. What is Russia doing? And yes, they have certain crafts, those propagandists in Russia. They can diversify their message and how to do it. They say one thing to Russians and another thing to people abroad. They know it's going to work in a given country or that might work in a given country, and they pursue it in a certain way. Today, they do not want to convince Europeans that Putin is fighting Nazis in Ukraine. No, it is a message that is aimed at Russians. For them, it would be okay if we believe that the crisis is caused by sanctions and if we start pressuring our politicians to do away, to lift sanctions, because this is when we're going to have a better lives. And what else? The economic situations will still depend on Putin, even if sanctions are lifted, aren't they? For example, he will control the flow of gas, right? So this is a quite crafty way of pursuing disinformation. I looked at those pro-Russian channels in various spaces in European countries. And at a certain point, I actually started thinking this way. You know what? They have a point. The crisis is there because the sanctions have been introduced. And I had to give it some more thought. I had to delve deeper to actually understand that they are pushing this message to change the way we think. Now, how people are empathetic towards Putin. There are milieux in Putin that deeply sympathize with Putin. Grzegorz Braun, a Polish MP, gathered his parliamentary team. He was the only Polish MP, but he had his guests there, and he hosted, or rather, he promoted this message, stop Ukrainization in Russia. And then there was this protest organized by Wojciech Olszański in Warsaw. He organized this protest in Warsaw. Mr. Braun joined them, and they delivered messages. And one of the addresses covered basically, let me rephrase that, one of the addresses was fully empathetic to Putin. Never had I seen such understanding for Putin, you know. According to this message, to this address, Putin, the poor thing, had to start the war. He had to enter Ukraine because Russia is truly afraid of NATO. It was said explicitly, Russia is terrified of NATO expansion. They were terrified. They had no choice. They are the victim. That's what the message said. They are the victim, and there is this bloodthirsty NATO that's the cause. And, you know, you have to understand why Putin is doing what he's doing, you know. He's terribly anxious. And it is something that was actually said in the Polish parliament. You can find it online. So there are circles which fully empathize with Putin. Anna. So this is where you could describe it as useful idiots. They've always been out there, but you know, the key word in useful idiots is idiots. There have always been some idiots. You will always find people who believe that they have certain rationale, but basically they pursue and promote views that are idiotic. So, yes, those Russian propagandists are, you know, they have a certain craft, but there are some weaknesses there too. When you multiply narratives, they contradict one another. You can see it clearly when you look at the regime, because the propagandists are getting lost in their own messages when they are covering mobilization. No war, but mobilization. We've been successful, but we are withdrawing. What about information that is not banned? It's open secret. Millions of people left Russia. Yes, men, potential conscripts, they left. Only in Armenia you have
60,000 w Tbilisi na przykład.
Tak, ale chodzi
Rosjan,
o
prawda?
osoby, o
60,000 Tbilisi. But in Armenia, you've got all those tens of thousands of IT specialists.
jeszcze tam z okresu wczesnego komunizmu. Tak?
Remember early communism? So what is communism? Communism is Soviet rule plus electricity. That's how they said it. What is electrification? It is communism minus Soviet power. So whenever you have something ridiculous, you can use humor. You can puncture that balloon.
Znowu, przepraszam, może za dużo mówię o swojej istocie rzeczy, ale to, co pani pisała, pani wie,
So, what you wrote is an easy. It exists.
w jakiej, że tak powiem,
The relevant thing is the scale.
znaczenie tego problemu, bo pewne osoby indywidualne to zawsze gdzieś tam się znajdą.
You've always had,
Problem się zaczyna wtedy, jeśli
people who think in a certain way. The problem begins when the Italian parliament is headed by somebody who
Salviniego, prawda, to wtedy mamy faktyczny problem.
supports Putin, not terribly well known.
Działało państwo, w jaki sposób to...
How is the state going to operate? What impact on the state policy is it going to have? So, it's something we can struggle with. I keep returning to the following thing.
To jest bardzo radykalny krytyk reżimu Putina, który już od wielu lat nie mieszka w Rosji, Andrzej Piątkowski.
Andrzej Piątkowski has always criticized the Russian Putin's regime.
Odpowiedzi na pytania, jak to działa.
When he hears a question how it works, he starts with the language.
Słowa, wytrychy,
So, there are certain key words,
rzeczy, instytucji, które funkcjonują,
descriptions.
zupełnie co innego. Nie można
They mean something else.
prawda?
So, courts,
Wczesnej Rosji, bo to nie funkcjonuje.
basically, courts don't properly exist in Russia.
Kłóci o pieniądze, czyli ważna sprawa.
So, an important thing to oligarchs,
Idą do sądu w Petersburgu.
they have a dispute. Do they go to court? No. In Russia? No, they go to a European court because this is where justice can be meted out.
Jeśli się troszeczkę zastanowić,
So just think about it.
no, bardzo płytka, ale to jest
This narrative that they promote is shallow.
jednej rzeczy.
But what is needed there
Pewnej pracy umysłowej.
is certain intellectual work that you have to do. If you want to defeat disinformation, if you want to be effective,
Leniwym podejściem pasywnym
then you cannot be lazy about it.
czegoś bardziej aktywnego, to wygrywamy pod
And when we get active, we win twofold. We are effective in our struggle against disinformation, and on top of that, we get other benefits because we develop civic society. Media literacy is developed. Scandinavian countries are a good example, an optimistic example. They operate various courses in schools, they train their public servants, and it works. It's harder for Russia to be successful in Scandinavia in this way than in the old EU countries where this education, those efforts, educational efforts, are not implemented. Yes, there is a threat, but I'd rather we didn't overestimate their creativity. EU versus Dininfo, I'm the head, some of you might know it. If you don't, join us on our website, in the social media. Every week for 7 years, we have been updating our database of disinformation. It's searchable in a number of ways. When you go there, you will see that most of the narrative that you see in the infosphere is quite old. So, The main two messages that Russia is doing to actually justify what they do, the denazification and the alleged Ukrainian genocide on Russians. These were generated large scale after the Euromaidan in 2013. Russia hated it. And then they have been reused and reused multiple times in the last 8 years. What about the other narrative? I quite like it. The so-called biological labs that allegedly have been developing biological weapons that are supposed to destroy Russians, and they are somewhere in, hidden places funded by Americans. It has also been around for years, and the Crimea narrative, it's even older, yes, because they claim that the Crimea has always been Russian, right? Look at it long term. How do they push those messages? When you take a closer look, it's boring and painfully predictable. Yes, you get some so-called twists, because they try to reach out to new groups, new languages, new channels. But in principle, it's all predictable and hardly creative. Now, what is it that keeps changing? What keeps us on the defensive all too often is how they promote it. So, Facebook might block a network of accounts, but they'll come up with another. They're pumping a lot of money into this machine. Let me remind you, it's not difficult to set up a new network because you can do it when you spend billions of the whole ecosystem of disinformation. Russia also is using such platforms as Discord. It's aimed at games. This year, the Russian ecosystem has used it to promote their narrative. So basically, they take muck and throw it against the wall. If you take a lot of mud, and keep throwing at the wall, some of it will stick, whether you like it or not. So, if we are being bombarded with a message a million times, we get more prone to disinformation. Disinfo Review, you've got this tab, and there you update those things. You update the examples of such activity. I would like to change the context of the discussion. And an important caveat. There is no equality mark here. I would like to ask you about your opinion. Now, Ukrainians have an excellent communication strategy that they've been using in this war. Often, you might be forgiven to believe that we are the victims of mass-scale Russian propaganda. But look at the social media. Look at how popular certain messages are that ridicule Russia, those messages that ridicule Russia. And pop culture is used, folk songs are used. By the way, they are not made up, because made up suggests that it's fake. But they simply use facts to make fun of Russia, to ridicule it, to show how inefficient Russia is. In the Polish internet, those messages are very well received, which is only natural. But also, many people came to believe, because of that Russia can be beaten. Now, the younger generation's approach to the war is being shaped by what they find online and by what is generated by Ukrainians. And the question is, how did they do it?
Well, I will try to respond to this question the following way. It's somewhat ironic because, well, it's not a big secret that I'm trying to share, but I've worked for years in public diplomatic services, and for years we tried to help Ukrainians in many ways. One of them, today, again, I would repeat, it sounds ironic, we were trying to help them also in this public diplomacy. For years, the situation was such that the Ukrainian society, with each Maidan demonstration, the civic society was developing, the media, different NGOs were created. But if we speak about the state structures, it was not so good. When I spoke to different delegations, I asked, do you have one internet website? There are myths about Ukraine, what it is, state, non-state, or the Crimea, and they said, well, we've got many different ones. The paradox was that until recently, well, the Ukrainians themselves were not really very good at that, although there were many skillful people and big potential. But after the beginning of the war, and again, maybe it will be a provocative statement, referring to the question here, maybe the Ukrainians themselves, they were not convinced whether their state is going to succeed in times of trial, and they did very well. Also at the military level, there were some positive sides when compared to 2014, where everyone was waiting for orders from Kiev that never materialized. In some places, some local leaders were acting actually. Sometimes they did very well. It was not really clear what would happen. Some signals sent by Zelensky. There were also some ambiguous things. But what happened suddenly, everything in an ideal way, as the Czechs say, it started to work very well. Zafungovala, as the Czechs say. Suddenly, the president of Ukraine became one of the best leaders in communication. Others can learn from them, as his experience as actor, I think, paid off. It turned out that the state structure is different, civilian, also military. Suddenly, it turned out that with some mobilization, also under threat, and some who perhaps worked individually but then joined in state structures, and it all started functioning very well. And the total war run by Russia leads to a situation the Ukrainians have full right to totally respond to what the Russians are doing. And one thing I have to say, I'm going to pretend the Ukrainians, there is nothing perfect. You can strive for perfection, but still in all the different actions, fighting disinformation, you have to be credible, of course. To give you an example, at the beginning of this barbarian war, many people, some of them serious, even some institutions, they were wondering, maybe the Ukrainians are overdoing it when they present data about the numbers of planes, tanks destroyed. There were some questions, and what actually happened was not at all. The Ukrainians realized from the very beginning very well. They knew how important credibility is. The war has been waged for more than half a year, and now, are there any, I don't know, proofs that the Ukrainians were saying something that was detached from reality? Comments without microphone, not heard by interpreters. Well, sometimes, yes, some events when something went wrong. Sometimes information is blocked during operations, yes, but at large scale, not really a big thing, treating POWs. This is really takes much effort. There are no cases of, I don't know, inhuman treatment of POWs. We all know what those people are doing to the Ukrainians. So excellent strategy to show who the good guys are. So a system operating at different levels. Everyone knows what to do, even if they are not sure. They have motivation to act properly. This is the clue of the matter, I think. I'm finishing. One of the popular jokes in Ukraine. Well, the Russians have lost so many, and they're still saying they're still fighting, and NATO has not even started, to have not joined in yet. So we, as the democratic community, we have not become part of the information war with Russia either. Well, in my opinion, as a former official, I can say that Our strategy is too delicate. We should, I think, do even more. Take off the gloves. As you understand well, Martyna knows more, but, well, I think our strategy could be improved. But in general, this is an extremely important subject, very interesting as well. As of today, I'd say that already today we can learn a lot from the Ukrainians. But the very foundation is about competence, determination, that fighting disinformation, using counter-arguments, it always has to be credible. Oh, and of course we need to have strong staff. We have not joined in the fight yet, so we are not there yet. Yes, I agree. Totally. In Ukraine, there are many elements we can, I think, copy. We can learn from our friends in Ukraine. Two things I'd like to say. Two elements of this success. The first, while the Ukrainians are doing everything in StratCom together. They say it themselves. They have drawn conclusions from 2014 and what happened later. At that time, there was no strong reaction on the side of Ukraine. The StratCom actions, yes, there were some analysts, data analysts at that time, some experts in communication, but the activities were dispersed too much. Now everyone being aware of the current situation, they started working together, and this is a key element of the success. The second key element is as follows. Well, the whole StratCom in Ukraine is built based on the dignity of Ukrainians. Resistance that inspires others, resistance against aggression. This, I think, is it's not clearly a PR trick. This is what I'm stressing. It's not just a PR trick, but resistance full of dignity. Very important. This plays a key role in my view. I remember my discussion with a journalist from Ukraine, Ilya Ponomarenko, working for the Kyiv Independent a few months ago, and he said that it's very easy to be Ukrainian at that time. He speaks to us very often, makes his report from battlefield almost, and he found some time for me to discuss his work and the events around. And being there, well, with full dignity, he said, well, it's easy. It's actually very easy now. It's easy to be Ukrainian. Now it's easy to be a Ukrainian journalist because you are on the good side of history. Just only that, and as much as that, especially when compared to the bestiality, barbarism of the Russian military. We all know that what is discovered after the Russians retreat and what gets into the media. It is also my impression, well, I wouldn't like to say, again, I wouldn't like to sound in a false way that it's been created well, that all the different elements play together very well. We have had Elon Musk mentioned also here. What was the beginning of this story with this satellite internet? I think a Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, a programmist himself, I think he wrote on Twitter, Musk, you are so rich, you want to send men to Mars, you connect planets, maybe you could help connect one European country with the world. And 2-3 hours later, Musk says, yes, it's an excellent idea. How many terminals do you need? And you will get them. He recently wanted to be paid for that, but that's a different story. But this was an excellent, I think, move. Someone in a completely different part of the world. Someone very modern, but also ugly rich. And suddenly he becomes a participant, especially in this also space that might be considered part of pop culture outside the conflict. But in a way, he is very clearly on one side. Recently, I think he damaged someone. He could have been a legend in Ukraine, and not only, but unfortunately, he did some unnecessary things recently. How do you see that? What do you mean? Has it been made up in the sense that someone has to have an idea, or there is someone, how to put it, puts all the elements together as if they were a jigsaw puzzle? We've got many different elements and we put together a nice picture that everyone will pay because they simply like it. Well, from my experience in PR, I can also say that, well, such things, using the marketing language, they sell well when they are authentic only. This is the word, I think, that is quite adequate to what is happening in Ukraine today when we speak about communication strategy. Adequate. Well, of course, things have to be made up, ideas, but authentic, something that is authentic, related to the right moment in history, events around us. Just to remind you, I'm a big fan of one such ideas that is used in an intensive way now, an info line for Russian soldiers who can dial number and say that they want to surrender and just discuss the terms of surrender. Excellent idea. The Ukrainians, even before the general mobilization in Russia, advertised that. Discussions, such short clips could be heard on the internet. The Russians, well, they call them, they are, calm down, especially the Russians. Calm down, you will surrender. Yes, you can do it. It's not so difficult. Then at the beginning of the war, another excellent idea, internet website, or the mothers of Russian soldiers or relatives in general who had problems at that time knew nothing about what was happening with the Russian soldiers, whether they were alive or not, or maybe POWs. There on the website they could find information about the fate if they were perhaps in captivity or killed. It was some reaction also to the fact that the Russians themselves blocked all information inside Russia. The website, unfortunately, later was taken down, and one of the Russian disinformation groups set up their own website with lists of Ukrainian soldiers that were killed or in captivity. So both sides used this idea. Let me just add another element. We are watching the events from the Western perspective, but let us remember that there is another, not Western, rather Eastern perspective to the war. I did not do very intensive research here, perhaps, but I had a look at, for instance, India perception. And in China, it's more clear, perhaps, but the way which of the messages is stronger. And in India, for instance, and I must admit that in many different media in India, it was, well, not really clear that the Russian version of the story was presented. Some impartiality was maintained, but actually the language used was the language of Russian propaganda. In other words, since spring, at least this year, words were often repeated that this is a war between Russia and NATO, not Russia-Ukraine. That this is a special operation, that in Ukraine there is discussion that they are Nazis, Ukrainians. This message did function there by osmosis, perhaps at the beginning, because Russia is closer, as if the relations are stronger. Ukraine is further away. But, well, it shows also that when we speak about Ukraine, if we say that Ukraine is winning this information war in the Western world, that not only politicians but the general public is getting the message, let us remember that this is not the only perspective, Western. You speak about the Western world, mainly Europe and also the United States. Yes, yes, of course. And which of the events during the war, information war, I'm speaking about the recent, perhaps 6 months, since the Russian aggression in Ukraine, what were the most important events in this information war? We will have time for discussion in a moment, but someone's mentioned this famous story related to the Snake Island. Which of those events and campaigns around them gave precedence, perhaps, or made stronger this Ukrainian message and this information communication war? From my perspective, I could, I think, list a number of such moments, events, when the Ukrainian StratCom did a very good job. Let me mention one that was especially important. I mean Bucha here. When we learned about what the Russians did there, we all know that. as there were journalists there. We've got excellent documentation of the crimes there. We knew very quickly what happened there. When Russians started their lies, trying to turn the things around, saying that these are the Ukrainians actually behind that the situation is simply a big fake. Many different narrations there. But knowing, again, thanks to the work of those people on whom we can count, we knew exactly what was happening there, and I think many of us were able to see what the lies, Russian lies were, what kind of manipulation was applied. The same goes for Mariupol. When we saw the bombing of the theater there, of the hospital, and then again those brazen lies of Minister Lavrov, who was saying there were no people there in the hospital. There was the Azov battalion only fighting from there. In our institution, we did also a big reaction, presented our position in our social media. It became very popular. On the left-hand side, we showed what Lavrov was saying. On the right, we showed some photographs of the situation on the ground. I think this was one of the most shocking moments, situations when we realized that some people, well, perhaps some doubts, very clearly it showed what the Russians are doing. Yes, I agree. Bucha is an incredible example. You would need to have no sensibility, moral sensitivity, rather, if you didn't have a very clear opinion about what happened. But I think there were other moments there. First of all, the very fact that Kiev was not taken by the Russians after 3 days. Zelensky was offered emigration, and he didn't accept. Nobody knows what would have happened had he left Kiev, Ukraine. Well, additionally, I do not want to be considered a cynic, but still, when we speak about the war, there was hardly any reference made to the United States. And this is a country that plays a key role, that helps the Ukrainians win this war. Of course, there are things about different things you can say about Americans, some pluses and minuses, but the Americans in general, they like winners. Putin is no longer a winner. He's a threat. But both in Russia, not to mention Ukraine, but also in other countries, he is no longer considered a victor. And this has great importance about readiness to invest power, resources, political capital, and so on. And, well, I must say honestly, it's not only about the Americans, but also in other countries, especially Western Europe. It also played a very big role. The counteroffensive, the different successes, this is very important. And the third thing that plays a role, well, this has to be authentic again, real. If, again, someone was spreading false news, fake news, this would not be successful. You cannot replace politics and concrete achievements without, or can't replace it with information policy. You can try, but no, you need successes on the ground. So, being authentic, the whole nation working together, then they are successful. Even the fact they have not yet surrendered is a big success. The energy system, until recently when the Russians started bombing on purpose those countries, still Ukraine was selling energy, electricity. In September, even Poland was buying energy from Ukraine, as you remember. I live in Belgium, and well, a serious failure of the energy system, it takes 2 weeks sometimes to repair, and the Ukrainians can repair bigger things within 2 days. And again, this is a big example followed in China, India as well. So again, we don't have to be convinced, we know what is happening, but for instance, for other countries, well, arguments have to be presented of another nature, perhaps. And this is exactly sometimes the weakness. Well, Putin is not the first dictator in history who was doing that. There were some other bigger, smaller, maybe as well. And they simply did not understand the way in which the democratic world is functioning. Democracies are very much unwilling to enter into conflicts because of the value of life, comfort in general. But once democratic countries start being involved in conflicts, not only military, but they can be very much determined. Putin does not understand that, and I think the current leader of China does not understand it either. The Chinese propaganda, in the context of COVID, as long as it was based on some real facts, because, well, not everything was functioning ideally. In the context of pandemic, nothing functioned ideally. But when the Chinese, well, had some achievements, okay. But then when it turned out that the present gifts as if were not really gifts and things were not functioning, could be even dangerous for health. This was the end of this type of support, not to mention the Chinese vaccinations. Not many wanted to do that, not to mention the Russian jabs. But, well, in other words, one can perhaps reach a certain point with disinformation. But once it is in a very clear, brutal way confronted with the reality that does not confirm that, no matter what happens in Russia, outside Russia, people quickly realize that it doesn't function properly. A short anecdote, somewhat later, maybe still.
Anna? Yes, Bucha was an obvious breakthrough. Robert Pszczel mentioned another important thing, what happened at the beginning. The very first few days of the war, I was surprised to see what was happening online. Russia seemed not to have been completely ready in terms of messaging for this war. And there was this moment where they wavered. And this is when Ukraine used that moment perfectly. We still remember the videos recorded by President Zelensky in Kyiv. The key value was that he was showing, I'm still in Kyiv, despite the fact that Russia was trying to peddle this false narrative that authorities had already left Kyiv. And that shaped the Ukrainian spirit to a large extent. This message from besieged Kyiv was very important indeed. And one more thing that stuck in my mind, not a breakthrough moment, but it goes to show rather well what modern war looks like. Eurovision context, you still remember it. There was this Ukrainian band, they performed, they won, and then they say, this is for all of the Azov battalion soldiers. Remember what is happening in Mariupol. That spreads like wildfire. I follow it on Twitter. Soon after, I see this tweet from besieged Mariupol. Thank you, guys, for remembering about us. Why do I say that? First, because it's moving, but secondly, it was a besieged city, besieged, planned soldiers underground. They cannot get out. They are by themselves, ultimately. You cannot reach out to them, but you can, and they can, tweet to show what is happening there to themselves. This is something that they can do. And this information space has changed the war, it changed war and how we react to it. In a moment we shall have questions. Just one remark before that. It was interesting to see what Ukrainians did. I know it's controlled, and yet they allowed journalists, their own journalists and foreign journalists, very close to the front line. On the Ukrainian side, there were 3 bloggers, including one Chinese national. And he was literally embedded with the Russian troops, and he actually broadcasted Kazakh news, and one of them was a soldier. A total news blockade. You could see it clearly.
bardzo, że tak powiem, putinowskiego medium, gdzie
There is this Putin-friendly media, and many journalists never worked there. It was a bit paradoxical. It's okay if you don't come to work. It changed in March, by the way.
Nazwijmy to propagandowe młyny mleć bardzo ostro.
And,
Ale znowu mamy
you
tę
know,
sytuację taką, że
propaganda started working, or the return to work full tilt. Now, mobilization, the biggest propagandists, Simonov and others, didn't know what to say.
przekaz do końca nie jest ustalony.
So the message was not fully agreed on. Hopefully, at this front, Putin will fail too, just the way he's failing in actual physical warfare. Some time for questions, 20 minutes, and then we shall hear. Just a moment, rather, just a moment for questions, and then some housekeeping remarks. Our distinguished panelists mentioned well-known names, Musk, Grzegorz Braun. However, you forgot the best-known person that spoke about a nation that is barking at the gates of Russia, Pope Francis. How do we deal with such cases? You've got a person with huge authority, and they are basically repeating Kremlin's propaganda. And they go against the very idea of the institutions that they are in charge of. How do you deal with that? To be honest, I've been waiting for this question. Not because it's fun to answer. This is an existential war for Ukraine. But it is also difficult for Poland, although we are NATO member states, so are the Baltic states, and I hope that Russia will agree with me here, so there is a difference. But it is of fundamental importance. So we need to be binary in our approach to this war. It is not a moment when we are nuancing things. It's the Ukrainians who can do that when they feel like it, when they like it, when it fits their purpose. Because maybe one day they will want to have negotiations, you know, on POWs exchange. They can be nuanced about it. However, in such a fundamental issue, whoever they are, which is a white and black situation axiologically, if somebody is having a nuanced position, to say the least, well, personally, I think that the reaction needs to be negative towards it and critical of it, simply and plainly. Nobody had challenged the peace and fundamental values to such an extent, those values and rules that have been in place ever since World War II, the end of World War II, maybe the end of the Cold War. Some companies, some institutions, some associations, sports associations, and some individuals have passed the test, others have not. And it is something that needs to be said clearly. It's a very good question, and the answer needs to be in those institutions themselves. This type of approach will be, you know, important. This is the time of test, and reckoning will come later. You take a stance on such important thing, and it should be clear. It should be binary. Some people find it difficult, and that's bad, it's wrong. And if that happens in such an important institution, then it is something that we should find disturbing, to say the least. That's all I can say, and maybe others will be willing to comment on it later. Let me add something. I was in Rome when this interview was published. It was basically, you know, a coverage of a talk. I was at a conference and somebody said, listen, first, you shouldn't be surprised. Many people think like that here. This word barking. Many people think like that. And this is the first message, that we perceive reality differently from others. Secondly, the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were okay with that. They tried not to condemn it. They tried not to take offense. They did react more strongly when Pope pitied the death of Dugina. Come on, they said, there are thousands of people, innocent people dying every day, and this is when you react? I think that Papal Nuncio has been called to answer. By the way, we are talking about a person who called for genocide, because it's not about whose daughter she was, it's about what she said, what she did. And here, those words, seemed very stark. And the Western media, this was not a breakthrough moment for them when, people reacted. So nobody reacted in the West as strongly as people reacted here in Poland. So, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church as an institution, there is an element of political game. I cannot read it very well, so I don't want to comment on it too much. Father Ihor, a mic for him. When it comes to the communications, it's very important. We've been experiencing it in Ukraine. Now, we've been discussing hybrid war here, because there is war on the battlefield, but also there, and we understand that communication is highly important. A question to you as experts in communication. What do you think about it? What has been missed? What should have been stressed more that hasn't been stressed? And looking ahead, what do you think should be done that has not been done? Also, or mostly, by churches. This is an invitation to another conference, I would say, but let's give it a try. It's a difficult question. Basically, we are learning from Ukrainians at this point. This is the situation that we find ourselves in. We could come to Ukrainians and ask, tell us how to do it, teach us. When I've been studying disinformation for a few years now, and I would say that Ukraine is one of the first countries, not since February, but for longer, that has approached disinformation as a major threat. Disinformation, hybrid war, whichever way you put it. And they approached it systemically, and they did so after 2014. They deemed this threat to be truly significant. In many European states, despite the experience that they have, on the one hand, they say, yes, it's a threat, it needs to be fought. And on the other hand, well, we don't really know how to do it. And, some countries introduce education and it's okay, and others are, simply blaming the social media platforms. Ukraine identified it as a threat, and they started to fight it. I'm talking about fight because this is the time of war. I truly believe that we can learn from you, and we should. Once the war is over, we should sit together and discuss it so that we can learn from you how it was done, so that we can repeat it. I would like to paraphrase the words of Ukrainians' truth. The truth needs to be louder. We need to make sure that truth is heard everywhere. When we talk about information war and all these things, we are in this binalism, Russia versus us, or Ukraine and the rest of the world versus Russia. At times, we forget that there are a few other corners of the world, and we are wrong to forget that. Here in Poland, it is quite clear. We know who's right and wrong. In Latin America, in Africa, it might look somewhat different. To follow up on what the Pope has said, we should speak about this war in other corners of the world. We should make more effort there. And it is going to be more important as the war drags on. What about the UN? We'll see what they do. It's going to be more relevant the longer we have problems with food, with prices, with energy. Robert has said that gloves need to come off in our communication effort. We need to be more decisive in our communication strategy. When it comes to strategic communication, a lot has changed for the better ever since Russia attacked Ukraine. EU versus disinfo, this shows that we are more decisive, and a lot has changed in the last few years. So I had this special task force. We started our work in 2015. The task consisted of a handful of people. It was the only EU unit which dealt with disinformation at the EU level. Ever since, the approach has changed. It has been a major change, and threat assessment has changed. The way we deal with it has changed. Firstly, EU versus disinfo, so direct reaction, and how we occupy this information space to make sure that our narrative is present in this space rather than us being on the defensive and simply responding to Russian lies only. Political measures, a whole set thereof has been introduced that were not there a few years back. So what should be done differently? What else should we do? Now, the EU, our community, we need to follow the path that we have chosen recently to understand the threat better, and we need a spectrum of measures, monitoring, communication, being more decisive in choosing such political measures as sanctions too. And then, first the gentleman, Professor, and then Mr. Ambassador. Thank you. I've been living in Brussels for 12 years or so, but before that I worked for the Polish Ombudsman Foundation. And we talked about it. Should we discuss things with politicians who are threatening Poles with the EU? Before that, an event. It happened in Brussels. So I would go to protest Maidan with the Polish flag, much appreciated by many. And then I was informed about this event in the center of Brussels, organized by a handful of Belgian organizations. Axe Christi Flanders, a respected one, was one of them, demonstration for peace. But I was quite sensitive, so I saw the description. I saw that they want to appeal for neutrality, claiming that NATO is at fault, and not to provide arms to any side of the conflict, as if somebody had suggested to provide arms to Russia at the time. So I, together with many Poles and Ukrainians, we didn't troll them, but we wrote to them to make them realize that it was, basically utter sham. And Belgian communists were the initiators, and we torpedoed it to some extent. Only a handful of people arrived, and some of them had USSR banners. Now, young hippies, Ukrainians, took them to the right demonstration with the right slogans, and there those hippies could learn more, and they protested against the Russian involvement. You can see bots online. I've got this friend from primary school, from Warsaw. He would flood me with those niche websites that he was, in, claiming that Bucha is false. He is 40 plus, my peer, age-wise, access to information theoretically. He was convinced that he was saving me from disinfo. So, how much do we try to get involved? How much do we engage? When do we disengage? So it's a question of censorship. Was it the right move to stop RT and Sputnik, because now they have no more access? Was it right or wrong? There is this war, and we need to defeat the truth from lies, and yes, we are waging war and we are on the right side. But what measures can be deployed not to be equal with our opponents?
I think each of us has something to say on this. As for those niches you mentioned and when we should get involved in discussion, when not, this is something we have not mentioned perhaps before, but we should. Those groups, communities, still considered niche, but some of them very active since the time of the pandemic, especially when this anti-pandemic propaganda, anti-vaccination propaganda was very active. Usually they are very much affected by the Russian propaganda. I'm not saying that the Russians created those groups, but there is plenty of content, Russian content there. People that read it, those that earlier perhaps usually had nothing to do with that, but some start to believe perhaps in this content. As you know, once you see something many times with many repetitions, it seems that it becomes true, and we consider it true as truth sometimes. And those people who are very much involved, QAnon, for instance, in the United States, there are such ideas being spread there that the only politician that can save against a satanistic political plot that covers the whole world. So far, Trump was the only politician who can help us. And now some say that actually Putin is perhaps the only politician that can help us survive when faced with this plot. When this movement is quite strong in the US, has political influence, grassroots influences, unfortunately, can be felt also in some European countries. But usually there is anti-pandemic, anti-COVID propaganda, very intensive. And if someone is very much susceptible to such propaganda, read such content, I think if someone is radicalized, it's really difficult to speak to someone like that. I wrote about it as a chapter to a book. I spoke to psychiatrists, psychologists, and they say that at a certain stage, rational content does not work when speaking to such people. No rational arguments are accepted, just the opposite. Those people can get aggressive, and aggressive reactions are sometimes possible, even if the people involved are very close to us. This is a growing social problem. We don't really know what to do, how to react, we as the society. We do not know how to manage such situations. Well, we can think that this is a niche phenomenon not concerning men, although in fact nobody knows how many people are susceptible to that. It's difficult to assess that. The deeper the crisis, the greater the uncertainty, the greater the number of such people, because it's a certain psychological reaction. Some conspiracy theories help us manage uncertainty. Some people have problems dealing with uncertainty. They are prone to such theories. It's a growing social problem. We don't know what to do. We don't have any procedures, even at psychological or sociological levels. No, we don't know what to do. But as for personal contacts, we need to know that rational arguments are not going to work. We can actually face aggression if these are some people we are close to, it's good to try to reach perhaps those people, but not by confrontation regarding this attitude, those views, but trying to find something that we have in common in some other areas. So if someone floods us with such content, there is very little chance that we can convince them to our rights. Yes, I agree wholly with what Anna has said with regard to those so-called niche attitudes. But as for this concrete situation you described, well, I not only think so, but I know, I can see it every day. The further to the west, away from Ukraine you go, the more often such initiatives, sometimes even the organizers think that this is something good, we are acting for peace, but actually the more such initiatives can be seen again. The further away from Ukraine you go, to the west. And one of the ideas, perhaps something that can work, if these are, if you face people with some open minds who want to listen to arguments, one of the possibilities to show the Ukrainian voices, reports in a direct way. I have a big library of different Ukrainian sources in perfect English, because this also helps very often to show it in different countries. I'd be happy to share such library, podcasts, articles, literature, many other sources. So if we've got original content coming directly from those that are participating in the war, it can work. And as for another area, I have to refer to sanctions. I'm part of the team, actually, that was responsible for the sanctions. Yes, freedom of expression is extremely important. It's a basic value. Nobody is going to question that. But for me, the discussion about sanctions and freedom of expression is very much about freedom in general. Freedom is also about responsibility. And this is what we need to be aware of, also in the context of war. It's not really the problem that there is one TV station or website that presents a different opinion from the mainstream of the EU. But if you present content that justifies the attack of Russia in Ukraine, but also there are other channels, not in Europe, but also in other places, that justify the crimes committed by the military, war crimes, that was clear. I think this was a unanimous decision of all member states. That is why also the European Court of Justice also agreed. Yes, I agree with this freedom of expression, but it has fundamental opinion. There is no sense, I think, in discussion here. It's good to, I think, just stop visiting websites or ban some if they call for even there are some contents, fascist sometimes contents, those that call for even more aggression, more fight. Well, yes, we can have some who encourage supporting football fans, but after a derby in Krakow, it's not a good idea to go and discuss with the supporters of the two teams. I don't think it would bring about any positive results. But when we speak about this category of useful idiots, well, some of them might be actually sure that they're doing something good, but once you start fighting disinformation, soft or hard, who is responsible for that? Context is very important, of course, here. Can be compared to fight in the ring. Well, once you start fighting, you have to be ready to fight. You have to be aware of the fact that it's not an Oxford debating society, but you are in a ring, and you have to be aware of what you're up for. I participated in many discussions with Zhirinovsky, God rest his soul, or Molotov's grandson, but, well, once I agreed to discuss with, this was called the Moscow branch of Euro-Asian fans. They believe that Genghis Khan was the big hero of Russia, uniting Asia and Europe. They believe that Gorbachev, well, he was alive at that time still, They actually said that he has to be burned in a ritual way because they believed him to be the greatest criminal who destroyed the Soviet Union. And I actually went to have a discussion there, very interesting, but at the end, I asked actually, they were very often rich people sending children to Europe. Why don't you like Europe? You invest there. Because it's boring, they said that's what we don't like. I said, well, something can be done, certainly don't know it well enough. So if you are there, ready on the ring, you have to know it's not Oxford debating site. The final two questions. Yes, Adam? Thank you very much. I've got a question. 2016, a report was published in Budapest. Weaponization of culture was the title, about the export of the Kremlin agenda to countries of Eastern Europe. When I was reading this report, it was as if I was reading Clancy, Latlam, or Grisham. It was like political fiction for me at that time. There was reference to some Polish organizations, very patriotic organizations on the right-hand part of the political spectrum, also some names. Can I ask you, how do you see today the following issue? Which of the organizations, in your view, which of those can actually spread this context? Well, do you think that the list is very much topical, or should it be maybe complemented? Just to make sure, the report you're referring to, is it the one where there were some charts with names, agents, potential agents listed with matryoshkas on the cover? Well, I usually do not list names or organizations saying that these are agents of influence or real agents. I don't really know, so I don't want to mention people. Well, I can speak about different narratives, show facts, but well, outside Poland, we know that Russia finances extreme right political groups, also some extreme left. The extremes are usually, as you know, supported by Russia. Some extreme groups are both sides of the political spectrum today in Europe, and not only, especially the extreme right. Those movements are much more developed than the extreme left. But yes, certainly the influence of Russia can be felt there. Also, in a slightly different way, perhaps, Russian influence can be seen in Poland in those groups of radicalized groups fighting against vaccination, for instance, or corona skeptics, as they're called. But the influence, I think, is different. Well, we would have to clearly see exactly how they were functioning. They were not created as pro-Russian movements, but we can say that those movements were by Russian activists or propagandists infiltrated by the Russians in their communication, perhaps, sometimes not only. And some pro-Russian elements, ideas are spread in those movements. So yes, extreme right, extreme left, radical anti-vaccination movements also. It's not about everyone who refuses to be vaccinated, but it's about those who have radical attitudes there and spread different conspiracy theories related. There we can speak about also some sources of pro-Russian ideas in Poland, but I have to perhaps even say that these are rather sources of different antipathies, not sympathies, but it's about being against rather. The Russians usually complain that we are Russophobic in Poland, and because of that, it's very difficult to build pro-Russian ideas. So in Poland, the focus is on working against, today especially against Ukrainians, anti-EU movements, anti-NATO movements, anti-migration movements. These are the main common in Poland. So if you find on the internet, it's very easy to find, of course, some groups that have such ideas, spread such ideas. We should know very quickly there should be a warning, red light, and that there is something wrong here. Although it does not mean always, of course, that we have come across Russian agents in Poland. Ambassador Tombiński, still one more. the last, perhaps, question that could actually start another conference. We speak here about the way in which Russian reaches us, reaches our world with their narration. But the question is, why are we not actually able to reach the Russian world, the Russian society with our narrative? It's like an iron dome, as they've built around Russia, where we have problems reaching the Russian general opinion. Almost 8 months of the war, we've got so many photographs, so much evidence about what's happening, but we are still not able to reach the Russians with what is really happening. What is the reason? This is my question to you. Yes, an excellent question, perhaps closing this discussion, because we should, this is also my impression, to think about a counter-offensive in communication. What is more, well, as at a certain moment of time, we had a number of different media operating from Poland and Lithuania for Belarusian citizens. We were helping the Ukrainians also after the Orange Revolution. So maybe now the question is, maybe it's time for someone to think about doing similar things with regard to Russia, Russian citizens. It's outside my competence, perhaps, but maybe you'd like to make some basic comments. Well, we are communicating with the Russians. We were doing it before the outbreak of the war. We are continuing doing that. Of course, our scope for operation is getting smaller and smaller almost every day because of the Russian limitations to access to information. But EU Versus Info was shut down only 2 weeks ago, so we were doing quite well in Russia. I mean, yes, for the territory of Russia, yes. So we were active for quite long. There are a number of different operations that we are taking, hoping to reach the Russians. I will not give you detail here, but by independent media, different platforms, we are trying to reach with our content Russians. But I think there is, in fact, just one type of content that in the context of this war can actually reach, in the mental way, can reach the Russians, not thinking about the limitations, but this is very much about the cost of this war, financial, social, many people being killed for the reasons that even the Russians, I think, don't quite understand. And this is, I think, the main message that should be directed to the Russian general public. We are not going to convince, I think, Russians speaking about the independence of Ukraine, about the right of Ukraine to be an independent state, talking about values. No, this is not going to work. And we do not have much data, no data basically available, reliable data about the real numbers of Russians supporting, Putin supporting this war. I think that this might be a worrying number, but I'm not convinced whether the numbers that we are fed with, the numbers of people who agreed to answer the question from the survey, right? This is the data that we are getting. But speaking about the truth about the war, as you know, in Russia, if you speak about it openly, you can go to prison. If I were in Russia and someone asked me in the street about my opinion, most probably I would not tell them the truth because I wouldn't like to end up in prison. So, well, there are certain options that are limited, but still I am convinced that we have to speak to the Russian general public because we have to think about the world after Putin, after war. Yes? Well, there are a number of bad news, many reasons. Yes, the Russian society, yes, has been terrorized, traumatized with ever-present censorship. Russia has moved from the authoritarian regime where it was well enough to speak about passive support, but now in a totalitarian system that de facto actually has been sanctioned. Now there are some requirements. People have to, first of all, have to be ready to die for their fatherland, looking for prisoners, even people from hospitals, degeneration of the highest level. But, well, let us add to what I'm saying. First of all, censorship, the work that is being done, so that there is full control over the information spread in Russia for years. Well, I'm not going to repeat what has been said. It has been done for years. I would add, unfortunately, well, sadly, the weakness of the Russian opposition that is outside Russia now. I'm not speaking about those in prison. Well, what can they do? No matter whether they are also subscribing to some imperialist views. Well, we can speak about it when they leave the prison, or Karim Murza and others. We have to demand their release. But the Russian opposition abroad, outside Russia, is not doing, for instance, what the Belarusians are doing, those living abroad, Belarus. If there was something I could object to, or maybe make a suggestion, because this refers to the question that has been posed. Some of the comments of Zelensky cabinet, for instance, even after the Nobel Prize this year, given to 3 organizations, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Russian. Well, for the Belarusians, I think you need a different, perhaps, approach. Sometimes not all of them, perhaps, deserve to be treated exactly the same way. Zelensky, I think, the Belarusian society today is quite active, more and more active. I'm not sure, but maybe is making life of the dictator difficult. But the Russian opposition is not doing, I think, enough. It certainly is not a clear ally for us.
We can always have somebody to count on. Kidding aside, we can expect a lot of nasty things to happen, but Volodya is basically losing track of things. He's not on Twitter. You know, sooner or later he might say, I'm sorry, I had to leave for holidays in North Korea. That would be a great day. A few days ago they tried to change their retirement age. I'm not going to actually allude to what is happening in Poland, but it showed that there are some limitations of the propaganda machine. Yes, international affairs, NATO. People don't know about those things, but people know about retirements and pensions, and when they had to withdraw from that. Now, the Russian society is traumatized and sick. They don't have any moral compass. Morally, it's a sick society. Suddenly, they discovered that truth may have existential meaning. I would like to know whether mobilization is dangerous or not. Some people act like idiots. A friend of mine told me of this IT guy, a smart guy. He's an invalid, and he says, hopefully I'm not going to be drafted. And somebody said, go to the mobilization center and learn. He did, and now he's on the front, idiot. Ania, and we'll wrap up with an anecdote.
Ja myślę, że czy cała przestrzeń myślenia o kontrofensywie
So counteroffensive
wobec dezinformacji rosyjskiej to jest naprawdę
against Russian disinformation is something that should be discussed at other conferences, plural. At this point, we are only diagnosing the issue, learning which aspects of this threat are really important. Before the war, at the European level, we thought that it's enough to follow what's happening in the social media and how they work. But this is not going to be enough. If you fight fake news using a few fact-checking centers, this is not enough. By the way, the pandemic was a very good example of how it worked. So we need a counteroffensive, very much so. Robert, you said that at the beginning. We need to get stronger from the within. And this should be the starting point. And we also need a counteroffensive. First, we need to resist disinformation as it is in its current scope, because I think that we are not really resisting it, even though Russians are not terribly, creative. Only then can we seriously consider counteroffensive. Robert, a short anecdote, and then we will wrap up the panel. Hopefully something positive. It's going to be a risque joke. Stalin's Death, a very good film. You might have seen it. It's a very old joke because it's a Soviet joke, mid-50s. Stalin is dead. He must have been strangled, you know, or rather smothered with pillows. This is going to be somewhat frivolous. And the choice, heaven or hell. And you know, they don't know where to send him. And they are trying to encourage him, you know. It looked good in heaven. They've got films, not terribly exciting though. And you know, hell was really interesting, and they said that they have some spiritual affinity. So Stalin decided to go to hell because it looked really good, you know, all-inclusive kind of thing, like in a hotel. Goes there, it looks different. They've got fires and pits. But come on, comrades, why? Comrade. Seriously? Was it that you believed in propaganda for the first time of your life? So propaganda is a sword that cuts both ways. Thank you for opinions and a handful of important points that you have raised. And a representative of Bishop Pieronek's family is going to take the floor. An important announcement. I'm not going to take much time. Some information. Now, we know what's going to happen. There is going to be a Holy Mass at Peters and Paul's church in Kraków. I would like to also inform you what's going to happen after the Mass. Father Kazimierz Sowa will unveil a plaque dedicated to my uncle, Bishop Pieronek. On behalf of my family and my own, I would like to invite you very warmly. You might want to participate in this event. Now, the concept was born many months ago, and it turned into a project last year, as the speaker said. We had this idea to unveil it on the 24th of April, that is my uncle's the anniversary of my uncle's death. Unfortunately, it was difficult to agree on the text because we wanted to have permission from Krakow's Curia. And it took months for them to agree to that. And ultimately, we can, well, rather, Father Kazimierz, all of us commented, Father, we can do it now. On the eve, basically, of my uncle's becoming a priest, a few days before his name's day, and in the year when we have the 30th anniversary of him becoming a bishop. If you want to, you can join us. The caption on the plaque is somewhat different from what you see here. Peter and Paul's, Piotra i Pawła, 64 Grodzka Street. Holy Mass will begin at 6. It will be set together with our priests. It's difficult to find it. You have figures of 20, or rather 12 apostles there. So it's easy to find. The figures, the sculptures are outside the church. At 7, on the other hand, we will present, or rather the prize committee headed by Mr. Albrecht will present a prize, and Mr. Albrecht will tell us more about why these particular people were selected to be presented with the prize. We don't have much time to fit it into the time. At 6, the Mass. 20 to 15 to the plaque will be unveiled, and then at 7 we shall meet in the cloth hall upstairs. The entry to the National Museum, the branch in the cloth hall, on the same side of the cloth hall as Mickiewicz's statue, a Polish bard. Upstairs there will be people who will guide you, and we shall have a short celebration, and in veritate prizes will be presented then. Thank you.